Good morning and welcome back to the 30th Annual Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide. I'm Marlene Grossman. I'm the coordinator at the college, and I work in conjunction with Naomi Kramer at the Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Foundation. This year, we have also partnered with the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies, and we are co-sponsored by the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. I would like to welcome Haras Rafiq, and he is the interim managing director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy and a trustee for the UK charity Muslims Against Anti-Semitism. Haras has been a counter-extremism and counter-terrorism expert since 2004. Furthermore, Haras has served as CEO for the 7 years of Quilliam Foundation, the world's first counter-Islamism think tank, and is an executive board member. In addition to this, Haras has been a trustee at the UK and French government securities think tank, the Franco-British Council. He was also, until 2018, a member of the advocacy advisory group of the online terrorist propaganda at Europol's European Counterterrorism Center. Haras has testified at various parliamentary hearings, including all-party parliamentary groups in the UK and at Senate committee hearings in the USA. Haras, whenever you're ready, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction. And I just want to say, first of all, what an honor it is to be able to present at this forum today. I'm just going to share my screen so I have a presentation that's ready. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the triple threat that's facing our democracies and how anti-Semitism really is the common denominator. I'm going to talk a little bit about a definition of extremism. I'm going to look at the triple threat, Islamism, define it, look at the regressive left, the far right, talk about the strategies that are put into place, the CVE strategy, which is the combating violence extremism strategy, which I had a role in writing initially in 2006. Look at some of the pathways of how people become radicalized to the triple threat, to the three worldviews. And then why is anti-Semitism important to them? And then I'm going to look at a way forward in terms of something that we can collectively do. I happen to be Muslim and people of wider civil society as well. Before I get into that, I just want to share a story. Why am I doing this? Why am I, as a British Muslim born in the UK, 57 years old nearly, why am I doing this? Why am I not off doing something else as I was previously? So my background, as I said, I was born here. My parents were, my grandparents were here, rather my grandparents' families were here in the UK since 1901. My father, 1953, 1965, I was born, and I grew up just like everybody else. I grew up doing all the things that everybody else of my generation did, living in the UK. I was a Muslim, I am a Muslim, Pakistani origin, but very much no dichotomy between being British and Muslim. Did all the things everybody else did. I was a punk rocker at the age of 14, 15, followed all the music trends, the rebellious stages of joining far left organizations when I was at university. And then I left and I went into the commercial sector, and I was on the board of a number of blue chip organizations. In 2003, my daughter came home one day. She was 7 years old, my youngest child. And she said, "Daddy, I don't want to be a Muslim." And I said, "Why don't you want to be a Muslim? What have we done wrong to you?" And she said, "Daddy, Muslims are always angry and they're always killing people. I don't want to be angry. I don't want to be killing anybody. I'm only 7 years old." And this set up a thought process, a process of reflection, self-reflection for me, because here was a young girl, 7 years old, born in a British Muslim household, didn't know anything about politics, didn't know anything about Islam, the faith, didn't know anything about really the other, didn't know much about life. And she was associating being angry and the religion that we practice, Islam. And if she was thinking that, what are other people thinking around the world? And that was a very, very important question for me. And what are my neighbors thinking? What's going on? So I traveled around the world, and I was fortunate, came back, and I realized then that the majority of Muslims around the world have the same worldview as I do. That was the case then. Things have changed, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But there's something going on. So I left what I was doing, and as mentioned, I worked in the counter-terrorism and counter-extremism space since 2004, and I was on the government task force in the UK after the July 7 attacks, and advised 4 UK prime ministers, worked with a number of other world leaders around the world, and managed an organization, Quilliam, for 7 years, which was made up initially of former commanders for Osama bin Laden, who disavowed the ideology and theology, former Islamists who spent time in prison, disavowed the ideology and theology, and this led me to where I am now. About 7 years ago, I remember, about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, sitting in a room with 2 of my colleagues at the time and saying, we've been primarily focused on the biggest threat our democracies are facing from terrorism, and that's been Islamist terrorism. And I'll define Islamism in a minute. But really, there's something else going on. We recognize that there is polarization, radicalization to extreme views, really from 3 core points, if you like. One was Islamism. One was, we know about the far right, and then also the far left, or what we call the regressive left. And we came up with a term called the triple threat to our civil society, and we recognized that anti-Semitism really is the one glue, if you like, the fuel that actually holds them all together and actually helps them recruit to their own particular worldview. And if we really wanted to make a dent, we really wanted to make a difference, we've really got to get on the front line and start talking about dealing with anti-Semitism. And by doing that, we can also deal with some of the other issues that we face to our societies as well. So what do I mean by extremism? Extremism, for me, and this is just one definition, it's a definition that I like to use, really is the desire to enforce illiberal views which are against our societies, our liberal secular democracies, and they're in a complete dichotomy with the values that we have, and they can be violent and non-violent. As I mentioned, extremism isn't always Islamist, far right and the regressive left, far left, and there is a symbiotic relationship between the 3. They're bound together by anti-Semitism, and at various moments in their lives, people over the last, I would say, a few decades, people have wavered between different viewpoints. So what do I mean by Islamism? Well, Islamism is not a made-up word. It's a word that the Muslim Brotherhood used, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin from Egypt, that they used to differentiate themselves from ordinary Muslims in Egypt at the time and their own political agenda. There is a difference between Islam and Islamism, in the same way that there's a difference between social and socialism. Social is the way that we interact. Socialism happens to be a distinct political ideology that's left of center. Islam is a faith, a religion practiced by nearly just under 2 billion people around the world in different ways. Quite often each excommunicating the other because they believe they have the one correct version of Islam. And Islamism is a distinct political ideology that really wants 2 things and a tertiary requirement as well. The first thing is that they want to set up a utopian Islamist state and enforce a version of fiqh, jurisprudence, based on their understanding of Sharia as state law. The second thing they want to do is to spread that fiqh, that jurisprudence, around the world. And the third thing, the tertiary thing I mentioned, and that's why I put it in brackets, is to wipe Israel off the map, because they see that as a way of actually building their capacity, the opium of the masses, if you like, to recruit people to their worldview. Jihadism, as opposed to jihad, because the Arabic for holy war is harb al-muqaddasa. It's not jihad. It can mean many different things. But jihadism is the use of or support of force or violence to achieve the Islamist desires. And of course, Islamism was imported to a large extent into the Middle East by some of these people, and before, and especially by Sayyid Qutb of the Muslim Brotherhood. And he's really what we call him the father of modern day Islamism. And some of these other people are what we call the grandparents of modern day Islamism. So I just mentioned something. I mentioned a concept there. Fiqh, jurisprudence. Many of you will have heard the term Sharia law. Well, if you look, the Arabic word for law is qanun, and if you do a search in the Quran or Hadith, you won't find that word. Sharia actually means a personal part of the oasis. It's a personal code, if you like. There's no such thing as Sharia law. There's fiqh, there's jurisprudence. And of course, this wasn't done until recently by ISIS and some other countries. For nearly 1400 years of Islam's history since its birth, apart from a very short time in Andalusia. We never had fiqh, one fiqh, based on Sharia as a state law. And of course, you get different types of people that will be thrown in there as well. We've heard the term Salafi, and people say Salafi jihadism. Yes, Salafi jihadism is a fact, but not all Salafis are jihadists. We have the different categories, the quietists who will live in isolation. We have the revolutionaries who you might see on street corners, who might want to try and convert everybody to their worldview. Then we have the jihadists, the terrorists, and that's when this theology gets merged with Islamism. And of course, we have Shia Islamists as well, and Iran being, I guess, one of the leading countries that push this. What do we mean by the far left or the regressive left? We call them the head in the sand liberals, and they really live in denial about the ideology of Islamism. And they claim the word, and I put it in inverted commas, Islamophobia, every time somebody tries to criticize somebody who may be from an Islamist perspective. I reject the term Islamophobia, and I reject it on the simple argument that Islam is a set of values, a set of ideas. We live in a liberal secular, I live in a liberal secular democracy, and in a liberal secular democracy, no set of ideas or values should be beyond critique or even satire, even if those are values that I hold dear. However, no individual should be beneath dignity. Therefore, we use the term anti-Muslim hatred or anti-Muslim bigotry. These people, the regressive left, try and stifle and control the debate, and they have a bigotry of low expectations when it comes to Islamists, and it's almost like the savages can't help it. And what I mean by that is they will stand up for LGBT rights. They will stand up for racism quite often in certain parts of the community. But when it comes to Muslims, they say, well, Muslims don't understand, or Islamists don't quite understand what they're doing. We've had imperialism, colonialism, blah, 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 blah. And the best that they hope for is to try and get people not to pronounce death sentences on people who may be gay. This is ideologically inconsistent, and of course, mixed with the far left. One big target for them is Muslims who don't believe in Islamist theocracies. We've got the far right, and they all say things like all Islam and all Muslims, even me, are jihadists. If they're practicing Islam correctly, they have to be jihadists, and that's their reading of the Quran and Hadith, which, by the way, is the same reading as ISIS or Al-Qaeda, because the majority of literature that we'll find in English, for example, that has been translated from the Quran and Hadith happens to be from that particular worldview. They claim to be anti-Islam and not anti-Muslim. They claim to be friendly to the Jewish diaspora. Well, we all know that they're not, and I don't need to go into that. History has told us that they're not. And again, they will attack all Muslims who are trying to live an inverted commas moderate lifestyle. The one thing that binds them all together is their promotion of and support for anti-Semitism. There have been instances where people from the far right have gone to Islamist theocrats for donations and funding. There have been instances where people from the far left get funding from Islamist regimes, etc. And Islamists will go wherever they need to go in terms of, in order to build their capacity. Let's talk a little bit about the combating violent extremism strategy and why it's so important. And this is something that has been the bedrock of the response for governments around the world. And there are some holes in there. The first thing I will say is that if we look at the graph, the red graph, if that is a percentage, if you like, of views of people in civil society, and let's take Muslims in this instance, because we've talked about Islamism. At any given time, there are X number of people who actually will directly support the use of violence. It could be supporting Al-Qaeda, it could be supporting ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, or any other violent manifestation. Then we have Y% that have some sympathy. These are people who will say they don't support violence, but they have the same objectives. They want to set up a utopian Islamist state. This could be some parts of the Muslim Brotherhood, this could be some parts of the Jamaat Islami, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and many other organizations. Then we have Z% that actually don't support, don't have sympathy, but have some form of empathy. And this is almost like we don't support, we don't have any sympathy, but we understand why they want to do it. When working in this space, we really have the governments around the world have put into strategies to try and provide some form of intervention, whether that's arresting them, whether that's the Channel program is a program in the UK, which is a de-radicalization program. Doesn't always work, it has worked in some instances. Or if they're in the empathy space, try to rehabilitate them. This is what we call the sharp end of the CVE policy, if you like, strategy. I'll share with you a statistic that when I was working at Europol, which I guess is the European equivalent of the FBI, my then line manager, Gilda Kakov, said in an open forum, so I can say it, he said the shortest time that he has seen where somebody has shown empathy and then moved up the graph to becoming operational and showing support for violence is 2 weeks. I've seen other instances, case studies that have been slightly shorter than as well. If we just focus on the violent side, when somebody becomes prone to violence or supporting violence, we're working in a very, very narrow time frame. What we need to do as a civil society is try and move that graph to the left and build resilient communities. So when somebody is recruiting to this worldview, whether it's from the far left, far right, or Islamism, and they're recruiting by using anti-Semitism, by dehumanizing Jews and other people generally as well, we need to build through the war of narratives, through the battlefield of hearts and minds, and many other ways, give individuals and people in society the ammunition to be able to push back and say, I'm not falling for your rubbish. And this is what we call the soft end of prevention or prevent. So let's look at the pathways. The pathways, and I'll skip through this in the interest of time fairly quickly. Each person's journey is different, but there are 3 common factors. On the left-hand side, we have a view outside of the lens. In the middle, we have the lens. On the right-hand side, we have output solutions in inverted commas. Outside of the lens, every single person in their life at any moment in time has some form of a grievance, whether it's genuine, partial, or perceived. The leader of the 7/7 bombers in London in July 2007, his grievance was he fell in love and his father wouldn't let him marry his girlfriend, and he needed to find a solution. In the middle, we have charismatic recruiters that focus on creating a lens which is intellectual, ideological, social, emotional, and spiritual, and really to encourage 7 behaviors. The first one is the otherization, to say everybody who's not in the lens is excluded, is the other. Then we have the collectivization. Everybody outside of the lens is the same. Everybody to the left who's not part of this gang is the same. Then the oppression narrative, that everybody who's not part of this gang is oppressing everybody who's in the gang or in this lens. Then they have the collective guilt, that even if somebody is not directly oppressing somebody, by the very fact that they're not in the lens or the gang, they're complicit. Then we have the supremacism narrative, that everybody in the group is superior to everybody outside. And up until here, we're not actually at the violent stage. If you look at the graph I talked about, up until here, people aren't necessarily doing anything that's illegal. We may hate their worldview, we may hate their views, but it's up to us to challenge them. What happens then is groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, far-right violent Nazi groups, and even far-left groups in Europe will come along, and they will actually persuade people and nudge some of the people to point 6 and 7. It's very easy for them to do if other organizations, other people, social media as a platform, etc., have actually already taken people to points 5 already. And they'll say that self-defense of their ideas and their tribes, their gang, etc., is absolutely important. And then the idea of violence is justified. And this is based on working for the last 15 years with former terrorists, rehabilitating, de-radicalizing former extremists from different worldviews. And this is a common sort of pathway. So why is anti-Semitism important? Well, in order to move people through these stages, you have to, and I'm using Muslims as an example here, you have to have extreme ideology and then implementation. You have to persuade people that what their parents and grandparents believed was actually incorrect. It is their theological, religious duty to hate people who are the other. We've seen this before in Europe. These tactics aren't new. These tactics we've seen in Europe, in Nazi Germany, we've seen them in the USSR and many other places as well. These have just been tactics that they've just regurgitating. So what they do is they actually set up a group of organizations and institutions that try to replace the set of ideas. And universities is a great starting point for them and has been for decades. They target the communities as a whole by creating umbrella organizations that claim to speak for both their gang, in inverted commas, both outside and inside. And of course, how is this done? This is funded by setting up NGOs and shell companies to move money around. And we, ISCAP found, for example, some research that we did a couple of years ago, that there was at least $3.6 billion of undocumented money that was given into US universities, which led to a Department for Education investigation. They got the figure up to just under 18 billion now that investigation has stopped. The whole process is designed to create a rapid ideological change that affects communities and whole societies. Anti-Semitism is an easy win for them. It's the opium of the masses. This is just an example, and I'm happy to share some of these slides afterwards, of the types of organizations and where they play, where they're setting up these institutions. The triple threat really has converged on social media. Many people say, oh, blame social media for growing anti-Semitism, for growing extremism, for growing jihadism. Well, nobody goes online to buy a pair of shoes or to buy a pair of handbags and suddenly ends up becoming anti-Semitic or suddenly even a terrorist or a jihadist. They have to be looking for something. Somebody has to find them. There are people who are patrolling the internet, looking to recruit people to these worldviews. And in my previous company, William, we did a report where we analyzed ISIS's propaganda, and we found, and we looked at the theory behind it, and we looked at also for 1 month the types of propaganda in their peak that they were producing. They were producing on average 34 unique pieces of propaganda every day. That was for 1 month that we monitored them. And then it gets filtered down into through their amplifiers and to the useful idiots. This is one example of a conspiracy theory that was actually online after the New Zealand attack at the terrorist attack by somebody who happens to be far right ideology who believed in the Great Replacement theory when he killed, just opened fire in a mosque. We had Islamists, the regressive left, and the far right sharing this same one page, blaming the guy who carried out the attack as being a Mossad spy. And they blamed Israel, they blamed Jews, and said this was a false flag operation, and this was shared by all three elements and the three ideologies that I talked about. When challenged on social media, I mean, this just happens to my son, who I didn't know he was doing it at the time. I saw it afterwards. He challenged one particular person, and he reported it into Facebook. And if you see the image on the right, Facebook thought that this particular meme that said the guy who carried out the attacks, which was clearly false, didn't break their community standards. So even though I said that social media isn't to blame, social media is a platform, and the owners of the social media platforms that we have certainly need to do better. And finally, I'll just come on to the penultimate slide. We talked about all this, and I'm happy to go into questions. We're living in a time where we have all of these poles to the three different poles, if you like, and we try and attack. We try and find the solutions through giving facts. Well, the reality of the situation is that we're living in a period where there is a hybrid war going on, and there is a real attempt. Well, it's not an attempt. There is a real process of the three key areas trying to create their version of what they believe to be the truth, and it's all based on narratives and opinions. So facts don't matter. Whoever tells the best narrative, whoever tells people what they want to hear in a manner that they want to hear it, certainly wins the recruitment battle. And finally, this is something that I said in an interview many years ago, that you know, violence is a deeply physical act, but ideologies are the muscle behind them. And this is not an ideological struggle that we find ourselves between Muslims and non-Muslims. And this was in the context of Islamism, but it's generally true generally as a threat to our civil societies. This is a struggle between good and evil, and is not dependent on what faith or none that you practice. And it's collectively how people who are Jewish, non-Jewish, people of faith, people who don't have faith, collectively can come together and start creating our own narratives, and start the pushback and build resilience communities. And I'll end that. And I'll sharing my screen as well.
Thank you so much for, sorry, feedback. Thank you so much, Mr. Rafiq, for coming and saying those wise words, and from the heart as well. I can hear it. So I guess I'm going to lead off the questions. I'm going to lead off the question as a teacher in this college, and as somebody who teaches a course on anti-Semitism, because when I teach the course on anti-Semitism, I always like to frame it as, we have this problem. So now, how are you students who are sitting in my class, how are you going to proceed forward? What are you going to do? What are you going to do to help fix this problem that's so pervasive? So I guess that's my question for you, is as young people, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, how can they move something forward to make a positive impact somewhere?
Absolutely, that's a great question. The first thing is that we have to build well, first of all, I think teachers, and I have a wonderful training course on this that we developed in my previous job. Teachers, educators should have the ability, and we use Professor McAdam's staircase model for this, to recognize whether actually radicalization to anti-Semitism and extremism is taking place within their classrooms. I don't think enough educators actually know that as a starting point. And then more importantly, what can they do? Some of the things that educators can do is to start creating frameworks through critical thinking, critical inquiry, based on human rights, based on the common values that most of our students, young minds, actually at that age especially, aspire to, adhere to. And quite often when they're believing in their view that Israel is a Zionist state and is an apartheid state and want to promote BDS, etc., even though I categorically reject their views, I'm hoping everybody on this webinar does as well. It's not enough just to push back on it and say, no, you're wrong. We actually have to create some form of critical thinking, critical inquiry, to say, okay, let's examine that. Let's examine the worldview, because even when they, at that age especially, have these views, quite often they're motivated by their perception that whatever it is that they have, whatever views that they have, whatever they're trying to do, are actually a noble cause. You know, it's the ours is a noble cause phenomenon. So even though they are being anti-Semitic, racist, and a whole bunch of other xenophobic traits, they actually think that what they're doing is a noble thing. Their views that they hold are noble. It could be backed up by religious things, and that it could be backed up by what they're seeing on in social media or around the world, etc., etc. So what we have to do is we have to help to deconstruct, first of all, the views that they have and the reasons why they think theirs is a noble cause, without pushing back and saying, no, you're wrong. Because if we do that, all we're going to do is get just pushbacks like this. So start creating, deconstructing some of those arguments. If it's a religious argument, we can deconstruct that quite easily. If it's from an Islamic perspective, if it's an argument that's based on human rights, human values, etc., we can start deconstructing those as well. But once we've deconstructed them, we need to help them come to, through their own critical thinking, solutions where they can actually come to an end point where they're not anti-Semitic. And this varies from person to person. And I'm not trying to be vague. I mean, if you, a very quick example of an anecdotal one of a school. I remember the school that where my children used to go to, actually, when they were younger. They called me, and it's a flip side, and you'll get the argument. You'll get what I mean. I got a phone call from the head teacher, and the head teacher called me up and said, Haras, I need you to come in and do me a favor, and I need to talk to you. So I went in and met with her, and she said, we have some young lads who happen to be Muslim, and these were young teenagers. Actually, they weren't even teenagers, they were actually younger than that, maybe 11 or 12. And these kids happened to be from a Muslim background, and they were going around and they were beating up other kids because they'd read somewhere that it's their Islamic duty to go and beat up people who are not Muslim. I said, okay, that's not a good thing. What have you done about it? Well, we don't know what to do about it. That's why we've called you in. I said, why don't you know what to do about it? Well, we don't want to be accused of being an inverted Islamophobic. Well, our parents say we'll have all these problems, all these issues. I said, simple. Okay, let's look at what you would do if somebody was being racist towards somebody who happens to be from a Pakistani background. Oh, we know what to do. We call them in. We'd hold classes with them. We build up. We have a lens through which we can build some sort of critical thinking and critical inquiry. Okay, let's do that. What about the parents? Well, let's call them in. Let's have a chat with them, because most parents don't want their children to be racist. And she was worried that she didn't want to be labeled Islamophobic. The reality is the tools that most educators and schools have are already at their disposal when it comes to challenging other forms of racism. They just need to be tailored and adapted so that we can use them to combat anti-Semitism as well. And that's a framework that needs to be built for each school. And look, at ISCAP, we're happy to help to create that. But I think each school, whether it's a private school, whether it's a state school, needs to create their own framework. But it can be done by using existing models and existing frameworks. But don't challenge head on and think that's just it, because it just won't work. Because they'll leave school, they'll go home, or they'll go on social media, and they'll go back into their bubble and their bubble with their self-reinforced ideas. And we need to give them reason to explore other ideas through critical thinking.
Thank you. Along the same lines, somebody wrote that your presentation is very interesting. She was wondering if there were any books or materials that could help her understand better this topic.
I have lots of books. Happy to send them to you. My previous company, a lot of these are reports and books, tons of them. I have them. Happy to send them to you, and then perhaps you can distribute them. That organization has closed down due to COVID and me doing something else and the other board members doing something else. But I collectively have the intellectual property, so I'm happy to send you lots of reading.
Okay, perhaps the ISGAP website would have some materials as well.
Yes, of course. Yes, the ISGAP, that's one thing. The other, specifically on my website, happy to send books, but the ISGAP website, a lot of the things that I've talked about are on the ISGAP website in terms of publications, in terms of lectures that people have given. Just troll through the website, you'll find lots of things.
Another positive response, they thank you for your presentation, and they would like you to respond to the idea that anti-Semitism and anti-Islamism come together in some way, which she said she's heard so frequently.
Do you mean by that people who are anti-Semitic are also Islamist? I'm not sure.
Yes, that's what she's saying. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Look. Every single person who is Islamist is anti-Semitic. Whatever phrase, by the very notion of the definition of Islamism that I gave, if they are supporters of any of the Muslim Brotherhood derivatives, if they are supporters of any of the Jamaat Islami derivatives, Muslim Brotherhood coming from the Middle East, Jamaat Islami coming from India. And they're more or less the same. There's very, very subtle differences between them. If they are supporters of Islamism, they want to set up a utopian Islamist state and set up fiqh based on Sharia as state law, and they want to wipe Israel off the map. It's as simple as that. If you are Islamist, you are anti-Semitic, because you cannot be Islamist and not be anti-Semitic. And if they say they're not, they'll try and couch this into, well, we're anti-Zionist or we're anti-this or whatever whatever terminology they want to use. But you cannot be a supporter of Islamism without being anti-Semitic. If you're not anti-Semitic, you're not an Islamist.
Thank you. So I wanted to thank you for coming and spending time with us today, and for teaching us a lot on the topic of anti-Semitism and the triple threat. I appreciate you being here and for explaining this topic. And I don't think there are any more questions, so I think that's a wrap for today. Thank you for those of you watching. Thank you for attending, and we will have our afternoon session at 1 o'clock if anybody is interested in joining. Thank you. Bye.